Okay, great. Thanks so much. Yes, as Rupert said, the title of this talk has changed somewhat. And indeed, as I did a dry run of it yesterday afternoon to myself and a very bored 17-year-old, it also changed slightly then. But broadly speaking, I'm going to be talking about the effect of COVID on competition policy and primarily about what the sort of medium and longer term effects of COVID might be on competition policy in the UK. I should start off with a standard caveat. I'm obviously speaking my own name, not in the CMA's name. I mean, I should say that what I'm going to be talking about is something that we have been talking about within the CMA, particularly within the economics group, over the last sort of few weeks. Some of what I'm going to say is obviously by its nature a bit speculative, but I don't think it's fundamentally controversial, and I don't actually think, you know, it's. I mean, I think most of what I'm going to say is sort of blindingly obvious. Well, let's see what questions we get. One thing I'm not going to talk about is unless people ask about it, is our COVID-19 task force that is looking at things like price gouging and cancellation policies of firms, etc. I mean, there's a load of work going on at the moment on that. That's happening now. You know, I'm happy to talk about it if people want, but in terms of the future, I don't think it's particularly interesting. So, I think the starting point for what I want to say is just to very quickly go through 6 likely effects of COVID that I think are going to be relevant to competition policy, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the talk drawing out what the implications of those might be. So I think first one is, I think it's very likely that concentration within markets is going to rise. Okay, I think we already know there's a substantial number of firms are in financial distress, and I think it's reasonable to expect a reasonable amount of exit. We know that recessions tend to raise concentration. You know what Bedi and Petty in a recent article referred to as a cleansing effect of recessions, you know, whereby weak firms exit the market. I'm going to talk also about actually the nature of this recession. Maybe that some not so weak firms end up in difficulty, and that may have implications for competition policy. We know that some sectors are going to be particularly badly hit. So we know from the OBR Q2 estimates, they're expecting about 85% decline in accommodation and food services, 70% decline in construction, 55% decline in manufacturing. It would be very surprising if we don't have any exits. You know, we've already got some evidence of that. And this is, from a competition policy perspective, on the back of already concerns about increasing concentration, I mean, particularly in the US, but also concerns in Europe and the UK. The Resolution Foundation work back in 2018 is quite good on this. We're going to see, I think, an increase in concentration. Some of that will just be zombie firms exiting the market, but some of that won't be. So I think that's the first important relevant factor. Second one is that state intervention is going to increase. You know, we are already seeing state intervention increasing. You know, we also have seen so for instance, in transport, particularly in rail, we also know that the state is intervening in the sense of already relaxing competition rules in some sectors. So there are already orders for supermarkets, dairies, ferries, aviation, maybe others, whereby those sectors are being allowed to engage in some horizontal cooperation, which they wouldn't normally be allowed to engage in. That may be absolutely fine now, but there may be some implications going forwards. Third point is, I think trade flows are likely to decline. Obviously, just in the standard, you know, we know standard gravity models tell us that trade depends on demand in the importing country, supply in the exporting country, and proximity, and we've got a demand and supply shock. So at least in the short run, we'd expect there to be a decline in trade, and that has implications for competitive pressure within a country. But I think what I'm a little bit more concerned about is the potential for long run reductions in trade, obviously on top of Brexit, which won't help. If there is a bit of a backlash against globalization, there is a bit of a backlash against long supply chains, and we end up with this idea that resilience actually means having short supply chains that are very domestic. Okay, fourth relevant factor, which I'm going to I think is relevant to what I'm going to talk about is I think digital platforms, so Google, Facebook, so on, Amazon, are clearly increasing in importance. Now that's a trend that's been going on for ages, but I think there may be some implications for COVID about that. Fifth relevant factor is I think we're going to see an increase in inequality and vulnerability as unemployment rises. Not something that traditionally competition policy has been concerned about, but I'm going to suggest that maybe, well, maybe actually, at least in the UK, competition policy has been a bit concerned about particularly vulnerability, and maybe we ought to be more concerned in future. And then the final thing I think is a relevant factor to what I'm going to talk about is I think consumer attitudes to markets and to competition are changing. I think consumers before COVID were already beginning to lose confidence in the ability of markets to lead to good outcomes for consumers, and I'll talk about some evidence for that. I think that is likely to increase as consumers see governments stepping in to prop up markets, and I think there is a potentially long-run implication for consumers and politicians losing confidence in the benefit of markets for competition policy and actually therefore for consumer welfare. So those are my 6 factors that I think COVID is directly impacting on, which I think are relevant to competition policy. Okay, I'm now just going to talk about some of the implications of that. So, and as I go through, probably it's fair to say that what I say becomes increasingly speculative and long term, but also potentially therefore increasingly actually important if it's long term. So start off with merger policy. I think there's going to be 2 impacts on our merger enforcement activity of COVID. One is going to be a relatively short run implication, which is an increase in failing firm mergers. And then the second one is an increase in large firms acquiring smaller firms. So if I deal with those in turn, I mean, the concern of both of those is that we're going to see increases in concentration in the short run. And some of those increases in concentration may be good and some may not be good. And it's going to be difficult but important for competition authorities to be able to distinguish between the two. So if we think about, first of all, failing firm mergers, I mean, the basic idea there, I think, is clear. These are mergers where your firm A is buying firm B. Looks like there's going to be a loss of competition between firm A and firm B, but actually firm B was going to exit the market anyway. It was a failing firm, it's going to exit the market, and so the parties can legitimately say there is no loss of competition that would otherwise have taken place because the competition between A and B was going to cease. And we already have examples of this. So the Amazon Deliveroo, so the Amazon acquisition of a stake in Deliveroo that the CMA are currently looking at, our provisional findings. I've already suggested that we will clear that as a failing firm merger because Deliveroo, on the basis of our public provisional findings, is a failing firm that needs the Amazon money. If we look in Europe, the French-Italian cruise liner merger, Fincantieri and Chantier d'Atlantique, originally that was actually being proposed as a sort of national champions merger. They've now neatly swiveled into that being a failing firm merger. The issue from our point of view, I think, is that experience says that firms will often claim failing firm status in order to get an anti-competitive merger cleared. Okay, we see that often, and the hurdle for getting failing firm mergers through on failing firm grounds is therefore high. Okay, however, at this point, actually, a lot of these failing firm claims are potentially more credible than in the past, because of course, where you really care about a failing firm is where actually there's going to be a genuine loss to competition if it exits. And if we're in a world in which we have firms with short-run financial difficulties, which are fundamentally reasonable firms, but got short-run difficulties, then we may well want them rescued. Now, obviously, we want them rescued in the least anti-competitive way. But I think this this puts competition authority generally, obviously thinking from the point of view of CMA, in a very nasty position, in the sense that, if we are too harsh and are too skeptical about some of these claims and firms exit the market as a result, we will undoubtedly get criticised for doing that. Equally, if we are too lax and some anti-competitive mergers are allowed that we shouldn't be allowing, then we are storing up long-run problems for ourselves in terms of increased concentration. Okay, so both of those things are difficult positions for us to be in. So I think our merger policy around failing firm is going to become, the next, I don't know, optimistically, he says 2 or 3 months, goodness only knows, maybe it's 6 months to a year, is going to become increasingly difficult, but important that we get right. The second area of change, and I think this may be actually the more important one, is that we may be in a world where smaller firms are particularly fragile. So there's some evidence of that. And they have less resilience, they're not at minimum efficient scale yet, they may have more need for external funding. And this raises the concern about so-called sort of kill acquisitions, about larger firms coming in and buying up smaller firms. And this is a concern we already have at the CMA. We've already blocked the Illumina PacBio merger, which was Illumina, a large firm buying a smaller firm, PacBio, on the grounds that that did seem to be effectively removing a potential competitor from the market. We've just blocked the Sabre Fairlogic merger, which is again an example where it seemed to us that that was a large firm buying a small firm that was a potential competitive threat. I note with interest that Elizabeth Warren and AOC in the US proposed a bill which is going to be coming in front of Congress. They call the Pandemic Anti-Monopoly Bill, which is actually a bill to ban large firms being able to buy small firms. So actually, I think it's large firms being able to buy any acquisitions at all during the period of the pandemic. So I think the ban on any firm of more than 100 million capital market cap or more than $100 million being able to buy smaller firms. And they explicitly say the reason for wanting to do that is because of concern of big firms taking advantage of small firms' temporary financial difficulties. And we've already seen these concerns pre-COVID. I think during COVID, they will become particularly important to try and avoid these sort of killer acquisitions. We know there's this, we all know about Facebook, Instagram. There's an interesting story recently in the US about this Covidia Newport acquisition back in 2012, which now looks like it may have been an acquisition from a large player to take out a small supplier of low-cost hospital ventilators to kill off a low-cost hospital ventilator project. So clearly these are concerns that we already have, and it seems to me that COVID makes them potentially more concerning. Okay, moving on. I think one of the things we're going to see is I think we're going to see a significant increase in, a significant decline in antitrust enforcement. So I'm thinking of abuse of dominant position, anti-competitive agreement, because I think we will see an increase in market-wide work. I think this may be a particular UK phenomenon because of the particular market powers that we have. But I can think of at least 3 reasons why competition policy is going to need to get more involved in the ongoing oversight of whole markets, as opposed to what we traditionally do of what about individual firms, so a particular merger or a particular anti-competitive agreement or cartel or whatever. So why I think we may have to become more involved in sort of market oversight. So one is just because I think we're going to see an increase in concentration, and whilst it's obviously very theoretical, and I'm not suggesting concentration is be all and end all of market power analysis, clearly we are going to see more concentrated markets, and I think some of those markets will raise concerns. I think we're also going to have the issue of sectors that have been allowed to horizontally cooperate, unwinding those behaviors. And I think history tells us that when that happens, that residual cooperation can continue. So I'm thinking, if we think about supermarkets, for instance, they have an exclusion order at the moment that allows them to cooperate on things such as agreeing about rationing of products, sharing staff and facilities, coordinating on assistance to particular groups, sharing information on stock levels. These all make perfect sense in a world in which you're worried about resilience of the supply chain. Okay? They do not make any sense outside of that world, and it will be important for competition authorities to ensure that that sort of horizontal cooperation doesn't continue. In the UK, you can think of the dairy sector again, where because of reduced demand, they have an exclusion order which is aimed at allowing them to horizontally cooperate to ensure that product isn't wasted and that long-term industry capacity isn't harmed. Absolutely, very sensible. CMA were very happy with that sort of exclusion order, but again, we will have to make sure these things get genuinely unwind. And then the third reason is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think we're going to see a reduction in trade flows. That will lead to a reduction in domestic competitive pressures from outside. We know imports traditionally make up about 30% of UK GDP. So I think it's going to become particularly important that we focus on those industries where we do see a significant decline in trade to see what the decline in external competitive pressure is doing. Now, we have already done some work in the recent past thinking about how domestic barriers to competition can be reduced across a range of sectors. That was in a piece we published in 2020. I think we're going to have to do more work on that. So if we're going to have to be more involved in market oversight, one of the things that means is the way we do that at the moment is where we have a concern about market, we do a market study or a market investigation. So we're currently doing a market study into digital advertising. So we look at a particular sector. By my count, we have done or are doing 13 market studies and market investigations since the start of CMA. So that's basically 2 a year. I suspect we're going to have to ramp that up. I think it makes a piece of work that we had already started before COVID more important, which is something called the state of competition work. So this was a piece of work that was commissioned by the then Chancellor, Sajid Javid, and the then Secretary of State Bayes, Andrea Leadsom, asking the CMA to look at the state of competition across the whole economy. Now, and they talked about concerns about concentration going up, profit margins going up, entry going down, very much the sort of stuff that has been talked about in the US, and that Furman started when he was chair of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. Now, I have to say, when this stuff was first mooted, I was not happy, because I sort of think, how on earth do we do this? How do you look at competition across an economy? And it is clearly very difficult, and there are, of course, some metrics you can look at. So we've been commissioned to do this work. We are going to have to do this work. I now do see that actually it's going to become really rather important. It doesn't make it any easier. And I have to say, one thing that, of all the stuff I'm going to talk about, one place where we could most do the CMA with academic ideas, academic help, research, is on how on earth do you get a measure of competition economy-wide. Okay, okay, moving on. Another area where, well, this is perhaps a little bit more controversial. So I'm now going to talk about something I think should happen, not necessarily something that I think will happen. State aid. So state aid is not currently something we do at the CMA. It's currently done in Brussels, done by DG Comp. That's obviously not going to happen when we leave the EU. And there is an active debate as to what form state aid control in the UK should take and who should do it. Okay? My view is, and this is very definitely my view, this is not CMA's view, there are senior people in CMA who disagree with this, including our chairman. Said that publicly. My view is that actually the CMA should do state aid control, and that we should become the state aid body in the UK. And I think there's two reasons why we should do that. Maybe three, but one reason is the framework of analysis suits us. If anybody's going to do this, it's the framework for analysing state aid suits us. So obviously, if we take state aid for sort of social purposes, I'm going to put that to one side. That's not an economic issue, I don't think, at least not for competition analysis. But a lot of state aid is all about, there is an identified market failure, maybe an R&D failure or something, funding failure, an identified market failure, and a government is going to give state aid in order to solve that failure. And the question is a benefit of solving that market failure greater than the distortion to competition that the aid gives? Okay, that's a basic framework, and that is, you know, standard sort of microeconomic market analysis that we do. So I think we should do it. I also think another reason why I think we should do it is we are non-political, and it's important, I think, that state aid analysis is done in a non-political way. The reason I'm talking about this now is I think this becomes much more important post-COVID, and the reason it becomes more important is because the increased government intervention that we are seeing during COVID, it seems to me, is very likely to lead to increased future government intervention. Partly because it just takes time to exit a market once you have intervened, but partly just because I suspect government's going to get a taste for it. And I suspect we are going to see more government intervention in markets going forwards. And it seems to me that it's really important, therefore, that actually we do have a non-political analytical body of technocrats who is looking at state aid control, see whether on a standard welfare analysis it makes sense. Okay, digital platforms. So there's already a lot of, or there was already a lot of competition policy scrutiny of the digital platforms. So I'm thinking of GAFAM, say Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. So prior to COVID, there have been a raft of reports about how GAFAM ought to be regulated if it should be regulated. So I'm thinking about the Furman report, obviously Diane Coyle was part of. That's a report that actually recommended that the government should set up a digital markets unit specifically to regulate the digital platforms, to think about things like data portability, strategic market status, that sort of thing. Stigler Center report, led by Fiona Scott Morton in the US, came out with a similar proposal for a digital authority. The DG Comp, Vestager set up a panel of digital experts led by Jacques Kramer to look at competition policy for the digital era, again, very much focused on the digital platforms. ACCC in Australia done really good inquiry on this. We are currently doing work on this. We have a digital market study going on. We set up a digital task force that the government has asked us to set up to think about what a digital markets unit might look like in terms of its function. So that's what's already going on. But I think COVID, there are certainly questions as to what the implication of COVID is for this sort of regulation. As The Economist said in early April of this year, they made the point that, quote, the pandemic will have many losers, but it's already clear it has one winner, big tech. And I think that's clearly true. We expect to see a significant increase in online retail. That's already happening. It was a trend that was already happening, but it's been put onto speed by COVID and by closing down of bricks and mortar retail. So if we think about Amazon, I expect Amazon to get more product market power over consumers as it becomes a more important source of demand. I expect it to get more gatekeeper power over its suppliers as it becomes more important for suppliers to be on the Amazon marketplace platform. I expect Google and Facebook to gain in terms of online advertising as more retail goes online. We know that GAFAM, they are not financially stressed. I think the estimate is that they have about $570 billion of cash on their balance sheets. And I think we also know, or we're seeing, that some of their competitors and potential competitors are in poor shape. You know, the business model in a lot of these areas is, of course, that you have a desperate dash to try and get to minimum viable scale. During that dash, you are very reliant on external funding. A lot of those companies are now in financial difficulty as that funding might be being removed. I expect that to lead to an increase in concentration in these markets, either just because of exit or because of GAFAM buying some of these firms. And talked about kill acquisitions a bit earlier. You know, there's lots of statistics about just how many small firms GAFAM have bought. You know, the Furman review suggested it was about 400 over the past 10 years. I heard an estimate yesterday of 700 over 15 years. So these are very acquisitive firms. So what is the implication now of COVID for all of this? Well, it seems to me in the public debate, there's two directions that the debate is moving in. One is, look, hang about, these are all fantastic firms. You know, Amazon's been a complete lifesaver for us. You know, all the, you know, Netflix, complete lifesaver. There's lovely people at Apple and Google are trying to put together this contact tracing apps to help the world. And frankly, if they end up hooving up a bunch of smaller, weak firms, all the better. Okay, that's one line that you can see put forward. The other, to go back to the Economist article in early April, is much more, look, these things are, quote, vital utilities, Economist comment, and they should be thought, we should think about them in the same way that we think about vital utilities like, you know, water or electricity. Now, that's certainly going too far, but I do think there's a really important point here, which is, you know, I think it's important that we come down on the right side of that debate. And certainly where I come down on is, if we are going to see an increase in concentration in those areas, if we're going to see product market competition going down, if we're going to see increased gatekeeper power, that doesn't sound to me like a recipe for more relaxed regulatory scrutiny. Okay? So it seems to me that it is important that the regulatory scrutiny of GAFAM, you know, continues or is even ramped up. I think it's going to become more important, not less important. You know, I recognise it absolutely is an alternative conclusion that could be reached on that, and maybe we'll talk about that briefly. Okay, very quickly, since I reckon I've got 10 more minutes at most. Inequality and vulnerability. So competition policy has not traditionally been concerned about distribution concerns. It's very much, we'll worry about economic efficiency and we'll leave government to worry about redistribution issues. I think that's all that was definitely beginning to change prior to COVID. You know, so that the basic argument that actually market power harms the lower deciles more than the upper deciles is, I think, fairly standard. You know, the logic is, of course, that the lower deciles, they pay higher prices for product, but they don't have any call on the profits of the firm selling the products, whereas the higher deciles, you know, we may pay higher prices, but also we may own some shares in those firms. And there's some interesting work been done recently, Gans et al. And Ennis et al. In an Oxford last year, Ennis in a CPI antitrust article talking about that. So I think that's all fairly standard. I think we've also, pre-COVID, had become worried about the loyalty premium, as it's called, the idea that in a range of important markets, those who don't switch supplier end up paying more. Okay, and some analysis we did about a year and a half ago, we estimated that just in 5 markets, broadband, mobile, cash savings, home insurance, and mortgages, those who didn't switch ended up paying about £4 billion more than they needed to, than they would if they had switched. Now that is not a full equilibrium estimate. It's partial equilibrium estimate, but it's still, there's sizable sums involved. But much more interestingly, I mean, if it's just the case that those who don't switch end up paying more, well, fine. If you're too lazy to switch, that's not my problem. But that's not what we find. One of the things we find is a lot of those people who are not switching are what we'd call vulnerable consumers. They don't have, so they're in the lower deciles, they don't have access to the internet, or they have some sort of cognitive disabilities, or just they're badly off. And one of the things research shows is that if you are very badly off actually just this ability to make long-term decisions, such as switching your broadband provider or whatever, become difficult. Okay, it seems to me that COVID is likely to increase inequality and vulnerability. It's certainly going to increase unemployment. That traditionally hits the lower deciles, and so these issues become, I think, more of a concern. And so I think this is an area where at least public policy needs to care more about the implications of some market outcomes for vulnerable consumers. It seems natural that we should do it. If government wants to do it, fine. But I think it's important that it's done. Okay, 2 more points and then I'm done. I talked at the beginning briefly about concern that there's changing attitude to competition and to market outcomes. And I think, again, public confidence, by public I mean both consumers and politicians, confidence in markets was already declining pre-COVID. There's absolutely reasonable, legitimate concerns that market outcomes are not always good for consumers. So I just talked about the loyalty premium, something absolutely all the survey evidence shows that consumers hate. We know about online firms and ticket exploiting consumer biases. We've seen a lot of that in things like hotel online booking sector, pressure selling in online hotel booking. We've done work in that area. And it's absolutely true, of course, that markets do not always lead to good outcomes. We can have markets where we have, in some sense, a race to the bottom. We can absolutely have markets in which the outcomes look unfair in distributional terms. I mean, Stuka Nezraki's recent book on competition overdose, whatever you may think about some of their analysis, it does have lots of interesting examples about competition potentially leading to bad outcomes. So look, even prior to COVID, I think certainly I, but I think generally the CMA were worried about a decline in confidence in the value of competition from the perspective of consumers. Now I think that's going to get worse. We're seeing a lot of government intervention in the economy and collaboration with the economy, so transport, these horizontal cooperation agreements they're allowing. I think we're going to see consumers becoming increasingly comfortable with government intervention. I think governments find they quite like intervening. We've already seen more lobbying happening of firms going to government to lobby government to try and get government to convince us to do things. Firms would not be doing that if they didn't think government was open to that sort of lobbying. And I think there's a real danger that both the public and politicians actually lose sight of the benefits of competition. They can see the short-run benefits to some of this intervention, and they either forget about or they don't understand the longer-run harms to productivity, innovation, ensuring markets respond to consumer preferences. And it seems to me there's a real challenge for competition authorities to defend the value of competition. Okay, so that's not being pointy-headed and saying market outcomes are always perfect. Nobody joins the competition authority if they actually think market outcomes are perfect. But making the case that competition typically is a very good way of increasing consumer welfare. Okay, so originally this talk was going to be about industrial policy, and I think it was going to be something, the title was going to be something like industrial policy, it's not just about national champions. So I'll talk very briefly about industrial policy before I finish, which is, so originally I was going to say it's not about national champions. I was going to mention the Siemens-Alstom merger case in Europe and the whole debate that had led to we need to have an industrial strategy around national champions. And I was going to say I've never really understood that debate. It's not clear to me why protecting you from domestic competition makes you stronger internationally. Anyway, it was not a UK problem. It's just a German-French problem in that case, or more recently the cruiser ships merge. It's just a French-Italian problem, not a UK problem. Well, maybe not, because I do think there are, or at least I have a concern that resilience concerns, so concerns about the resilience of supply chains as a result of COVID, resilience concerns may be seen to favour national champions. And there's certainly a flavour of that debate now going on in government and in the academic community, well, no, not parts of the academic community, that's unfair, in parts of press, sorry. And so it seems to me that actually we may be moving to a world where we begin to get back into this national champions debate. And I think if that's true, I think it's an unhelpful debate. And certainly a competition authority such as ours should say that's an unhelpful debate. The better aspect of this discussion about industrial policy, it seems to me, is, we know that, to quote Krugman, whilst productivity isn't everything, in the long run it is almost everything. We know we have a productivity problem in the UK. We have had for many years, and I think that we know that competition is part of that solution, or competition policy is part of the solution to that problem. We actually did do a paper on this back in 2015 on the relationship between productivity and competition policy. I worry greatly about increased government intervention that leads to increased future government intervention harming productivity. And so it seems to me it's very important that we get competition policy on the agenda as a positive part of industrial strategy, that to counteract those sorts of concerns, to make sure we focus on the value of competition for things like productivity. So just to conclude, and I know this has been a bit of a hodgepodge of issues, but that's sort of slightly the nature, I think, of the issue and of my lack of intellectual clarity here. I think competition policy in the UK, particularly, but probably more widely as well, is in for a bit of a rough time. And I think COVID makes that rougher, because I think we've got three battles to fight. So we've got the day job battle. This is concerns over reductions in competition from increases in concentration, reduction in trade, increased horizontal cooperation, difficult merger decisions, concerns over the tech platforms. That's all fine. That's our day job. It's difficult. It's going to get harder, but that's our day job. But it's going to be a battle. But I think there's two other battles that competition authorities, or competition policy maybe, is going to have to worry about. One is sort of a government battle around increased intervention in markets, and the fact that there's lots of scope for well-targeted intervention to be good for consumers, but there's also lots of scope for poor outcomes. And we know, and I think the Philippon book is actually really good on this. In the US, we know that where you have intervention and you have lobbying, that can lead to very bad outcomes for consumers. And I think we need to make sure we don't move into a world in which, we don't move into that world. So we have a bit of a battle potentially with government over well-targeted intervention in markets. And then finally, I think we have this legitimacy battle, which is if public attitudes and political attitudes to the value of markets and competition are declining, I think that is bad news for all of us. And that is certainly something that we should fight against. Thank you.